Okay, so have you ever thought about like how a single event can kind of set off a chain reaction across the country?
It's amazing how something so localized can end up with national implications.
Exactly, and that's what we're looking at today, right? With the Laken Riley Act.
Yes, signed into law just last month, January 29th, 2025, by President Trump. It's been generating a lot of buzz, for sure.
Definitely, and we're gonna like really get into it. We've got news articles, legal analyses, even some opinions, from both sides. We're gonna try to get the whole picture for you today.
Well, what's really fascinating to me is how this law is so closely tied to the story of Laken Riley. It really brings together these really complex issues around immigration and crime.
Yeah, for sure. So before we like dive into the actual like nuts and bolts of the law itself, let's take a step back to February 2024. Back to the tragic event that started it all, the murder of Laken Riley.
Right, Laken Riley was a nursing student in Georgia. Her life was cut short, tragically, by this man, Jose Antonio Ibarra. And this case, it quickly became this focal point for all these discussions about immigration because of Ibarra's background.
Yeah, because Ibarra was a Venezuelan man who had entered the U.S. illegally back in 2022, and this is where it gets even more complicated. He had already had some run-ins with the law even before this awful event.
Exactly. He had prior charges, like up in New York City, injury a child, driving violations, things like that. He also got arrested in Athens, Georgia for theft. I mean, he was definitely on law enforcement's radar.
And here's the thing that really, gets me. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they had actually issued a detainer for Ibarra after one of those arrests.
A detainer?
Yeah, a detainer. It's like a request from ICE, right, to local law enforcement to hold someone for another 48 hours so that ICE can come and take them into custody for potential immigration violations.
Right, because they suspect they're in the country illegally.
Right, exactly. But in Ibarra's case, local authorities, they released him even though there was that detainer.
And that's where you start to see this tension, right? This real friction between federal immigration enforcement and the decisions made at the local level. It's like a key point of conflict that the Laken Riley Act is trying to address.
Exactly. So you can see how this case, with all its layers, quickly became this lightning rod, right? People were asking, how could someone with Ibarra's history be released? And what about, keeping our communities safe? Those were big questions, and those questions, they fueled the push for new legislation, which leads us to the Laken Riley Act.
Yeah, because in a lot of ways, the act is trying to close what some people see as a loophole. It makes it so anyone in the country illegally, even if they're just accused of certain crimes, they have to be detained by immigration authorities.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit more, because that's really important. So we're saying someone's in the country illegally, right? And they're charged with, or even just arrested for, a certain crime. ICE has to detain them. And the list of those crimes, it's pretty specific.
It is, and I think it's worth remembering that initially, the act was mostly focused on theft-related offenses. But it changed a lot as it went through Congress. It's a textbook example of how laws get made, all that back and forth.
Oh, definitely. The final version that actually became law, well, it included amendments that covered a much wider range of crimes. For example, there's the Cornyn Amendment. That one makes detention mandatory for anyone charged with or convicted of assaulting a law enforcement officer. And then there's the Ernst Amendment, which is sometimes called Sarah's Law. That one focuses on anyone charged with or convicted of crimes that cause death or serious bodily injury, like drunk driving.
So you see this expansion, right? You went from just property crimes to offenses that are seen as a more direct threat to public safety.
Right, and there's this other part of the act that gives states a lot of power, right?
Oh yeah, the act actually says states can sue the federal government if they think the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE, isn't actually enforcing these detention rules. And what's really interesting here is that the bar for proving harm is super low. It's only $100. So states now, they have a pretty strong tool to hold the feds accountable for implementing this law.
So we've got that initial spark, right? The tragic case of Laken Riley. And then we have the Laken Riley Act, which is designed to prevent things like that from happening again by making sure that people who are in the country illegally and who are accused of these certain crimes are detained by ICE. But I'm guessing getting this law passed was probably not an easy process.
Oh no, definitely not. It had quite a journey through Congress. And I think understanding that journey, it really helps us understand the whole political climate around immigration, all the different viewpoints.
So this wasn't something that just happened overnight, right?
Oh no, not at all. It actually first popped up in the House back in March of 2024. During the 118th Congress,
right.
That version, H.R. 7511, it passed the House, but then it stalled in the Senate. Didn't go anywhere.
Interesting.
Yeah, and It's kind of wild to see how things can change so quickly, especially when we're talking about, a hot-button issue like immigration. Fast forward to the 119th Congress, and that same bill, well, almost the same bill, they reintroduced it as H.R. 29 and S5.
Right.
And this time, it just sailed through both chambers. Bipartisan support. In fact, it was the very first bill passed in the 119th Congress.
Wow, so it really gained momentum.
It did. President Trump signed it into law later that same month.
And that bipartisan support, I mean, that's what really jumped out at me. When you look at the actual voting records, it's kind of interesting. Some Democrats who voted against you at the first time around in the 118th Congress, they flipped. They actually voted for it in the 119th.
Yeah, and I think that shift says a lot. It makes you think that the case of Laken Riley and all the public reaction that came after, it must have really hit home for some of those lawmakers, even across party lines. I mean, it shows you how powerful public opinion can be. Sometimes, like a tragic story like what happened to Laken, it can really push for change, even in a place like Congress where things usually move pretty slow.
Right. It makes you wonder, were those Democrats, were they reacting to a change in what people in their districts were saying, or was it more about, politics? Something to watch as we see what happens with this law, I guess.
Oh, definitely. Adds another layer to it all, for sure. And speaking of layers, we can't forget that this law has really kicked off some pretty heated debates all over the country. You've got strong opinions on both sides.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are groups that are 100% behind the Laken Riley Act. They see it as absolutely necessary to keep people safe. And then on the other side, you've got this really wide range of organizations that are, well, they're worried about what might happen because of this law.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag. So on the support side, you've got groups like FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and then you have the Association of Mature American Citizens. These groups have always been all about stricter immigration controls. For them, the Laken Riley Act is like a win. It's part of this bigger effort to crack down on illegal immigration. They think that if these detention rules are enforced, it'll stop crime and that'll make communities safer.
Right. They see it as a way to prevent another tragedy like what happened to Laken Riley. But then, like you said, on the other side, you have a lot of different organizations that are waving some pretty big red flags about this act. We're talking about the American Immigration Council, the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I mean, so many others. And this group, it's not just one type of organization. You've got civil rights groups, legal groups, even some religious and labor organizations in there.
And I think the fact that you have all these different groups coming together to push back against this law, I think it speaks volumes. They might have different focuses, but they all see something in the Laken Riley Act that worries them. They're worried about things like due process, racial profiling, and, people's basic rights.
Wow, so that's a pretty powerful group to be going up against this law. What are some of the specific things they're bringing up? What worries them the most about the Laken Riley Act?
Well, one of the biggest points of disagreement, and this is something a lot of legal experts are pointing out, is that part about mandatory detention for people who are just charged with a crime, they don't even have to be convicted.
Wait, so let me get this straight. Someone could be detained by ICE, maybe for a long time, even if they haven't actually been found guilty in court.
Yep, that's exactly it. And that's where all those worries about due process come in. Because, due process is a huge deal in our legal system. It's all about making sure everyone gets treated fairly and has a fair trial. The people who are against this law, they say this part of the Laken Riley Act kind of goes against that whole idea. They say it chips away at the presumption of innocence, that idea that you're innocent until proven guilty.
Right. So to them, it seems like the Laken Riley Act is kind of stacking the deck in favor of detention, right? It could end up hurting people who haven't even been proven guilty of anything. And I bet they're also concerned that this focus on detention will mean more people end up in those immigration detention centers, which already have a pretty bad reputation.
Exactly. They're saying that this could create a system where people are basically punished before they even get their day in court. And that brings up all sorts of questions about fairness, and then there's the concern about racial profiling. Are people going to be targeted just because of their race or where they come from, instead of because there's actual evidence they did something wrong?
So it's interesting, right? We started with this one specific and really sad case, but now we're seeing how this law is connected to all these bigger issues, the power balance between the states and the federal government, the rights of immigrants, all the complexities of due process. It's clear that the Laken Riley Act is about way more than just one case.
You got it. And it's become this flashpoint in this much larger debate about immigration, about the justice system, and about how we can be a country that follows the law, but also protects individual rights. It's a tough balancing act.
It really is. A lot to think about, for sure. And something tells me this conversation isn't over yet. So what's next? What should our listeners be watching out for as this law starts to, actually take effect? Yeah, it does feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. This is just the beginning.
Yeah.
The Laken Riley Act is officially a law, but, it's not like we have all the answers yet. There's still so much to figure out.
Exactly. I mean, we've heard what both sides have to say, but now we want to hear from you, the listener. What do you think about all this? Do you think this law gets it right? Does it do a good job of balancing public safety with, individual rights?
One thing that's been on my mind, especially as someone who follows immigration policy, is that this act uses that term criminal alien a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And that term, well, it has a lot of baggage. Historically and legally, it's kind of loaded. You know what I mean? It's something to keep in mind as we see how this plays out in the courts, what they do with that.
That's a really good point. And here are more things we want you to think about. How will this law actually work in real life? Is it really going to stop crime? Or is it just going to lead to more people being detained, which could, really put a strain on the whole immigration system, which is already pretty overwhelmed as it is.
Right, and we can't forget about the money side of things either.
Oh, yeah.
Think about it, detaining more people, all the legal challenges, states suing the government, all of that costs money, and ultimately, who's paying for that? The taxpayers.
That's true. And it also makes me wonder if the courts will, uphold all the parts of this act, especially that part about states being able to sue the federal government, Could that end up setting some kind of precedent for other laws that target specific groups based on what they might have done, even if they haven't been convicted?
That's something some legal experts are talking about, that slippery slope idea.
Yeah.
Could this open the door for laws that take away due process protections from other groups? All in the name of, keeping people safe. It's something we should all be thinking about.
This whole deep dive has given me, and hopefully all of you listening, a lot to think about. The Laken Riley Act is a complicated law. It has all these different consequences, It comes from this really sad story, and there are strong feelings on both sides.
Yeah, it really highlights how tough it is, even in the country that's built on laws, to find that balance. Keeping people safe while still protecting their individual freedoms. That's something we're always going to be grappling with.
It's definitely an ongoing conversation and one we need to keep having. And it's a conversation we all need to be a part of. So stay informed, keep asking questions, and most importantly, talk to each other about this stuff. Just, respectfully, of course. Knowledge is power, especially when we're talking about issues that shape the kind of future we want to live in. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Laken Riley Act.